Hello guys, this is Panzermarch36, and today's video is going to be a post-build review of Dragon 6480. This is the Dragon Panzer.I Ausf.B with Abwurfvorrichtung, which is a fancy way of saying a demolition charge laying device, as you can see on the back here. This kit is a perfect example of why Dragon is not exactly a much liked modeling company anymore, because this kit has all the Dragon standards. We got really vague instructions that have misnumbered parts. We got instructions that completely skip over the putting on of some parts. We have some poor fit. We have historical inaccuracies. We have parts that are completely missing from the build. It's a bit of a pain in the butt project to build, but there's not really much choice, because if you want to build this version of the vehicle, Panzer.I Ausf.B with the demolition sling, there is only this kit, and in 1/16 scale there's the Takom kit, which is actually really good, and I kind of wish I had gone with it. Even though it costs almost twice as much, it would have been an enjoyable build process instead of this one. So this video is a post-build review. My post-build reviews are basically kit reviews, but where I've actually built the thing. So instead of a inbox review where I just talk about how everything looks, I can actually talk about how things fit and all that good stuff that actually matters to the build. Generally, I don't talk about the history of the vehicle, but I think I will today, because this is a very curious vehicle that even I think is kind of strange. So this is a Panzer.I Ausf.B, standard Panzer.I with the longer engine, and then it has this thing on the back, which is an arm with a trap door on this box, into which there is a demolition charge. And there's two types. There's this one with this kind of big tall arm. There's another type which has more of like a ramp that comes off the back, where the demolition charge just kind of slides up off the back. And this seems like it's a terrible idea. If you drive your lightly armored Panzer.I up to like a bunker, and then you back up and then just drop this huge bomb, seems like you're gonna die, right? But apparently these vehicles were used quite effectively. Hamilcar Barkas sent me a after action report talking about how these vehicles were used, and it seems like they actually were successful, even though they seem like a death trap basically. Also, before I get into the actual build process, I want to point out a couple of things that I've added that aren't standard in this kit, just to make you guys aware of what comes in the kit versus what does not. So first of all, I've added a tow cable in the front wrapped around the front light and these front tow points. This is just something I see sometimes in photos, and I think it's pretty cool, so I wanted to emulate that here in the model. I use a spare electronic cable from an old set of earbuds as the actual cable, and then the little end pieces of the tow cable itself are from this T-Rex 1/35 scale cable set, and I use the very small ones at the end there. You can barely see them, which I believe are the track change cables from a Tiger, but they look exactly like the Panzer.I style as well. On the subject of 3D printed parts, you'll also notice that there's little tiny black lifting hooks on some parts on the vehicle, like on the engine deck there as well. These are also from T-Rex 3D printed. Now the kit gives you these parts in plastic, and they look fine. They're a little overscale and a little bit simplified, but I went with the 3D printed parts because I wanted to give the T-Rex stuff a shot, and they do look better. They have these tiny little holes molded in them, and they're, or I guess, printed in them, and they do add a level of detail, but they're not really required at all. I have also added a flamethrower, which is not standard, but I found a photograph of this type of Panzer.I. This is why I built this kit, because I saw a cool photo of this type of Panzer.I with a demolition charge layer, and it had been field modified with a flamethrower. I think a Flammenwerfer 38, I think that's what it is. So I made this myself with some styrene tube and stuff, but that's not part of the build itself. I also upgraded the tool clamps because they were missing some handles, so I just added photo etch handles onto the molded on tool clamps. And last but not least, I also added the smoke candle on the back here because it was not included in the kit. This is a 3D printed part from FC Model Trend. We'll get into this part later, as well as all the other details. I have also not added any tracks to the vehicle. The kit comes with magic tracks, which are the individual link small molded Dragon kit tracks that come off the sprue already. They're just come in a bag, and they're very useful. I used them when I made the Panzer.I Ausf.A by Dragon a couple years ago, and they're great. I just haven't put them on because I've got some 3D printed tracks coming from Tankraft, another YouTube modeling guy just like me, and I want to give those a shot, so I've left them off for now, but the kit tracks are perfectly fine, so you can go with those. That's not an issue. So now let's actually get into the process of building this kit. This might take a little while though, because I have actually 2 full pieces of paper with notes on them, because that's just how much of a nightmare this build was. But we're going to go through each step in the process, and essentially if you're building this kit you can follow along and I'll explain how to fix all the stuff. Alright, so in step number 1 you start off with the assembly of the wheels, the row wheels, and it starts off with a dragon instruction error. It's very standard instructions to have, if you have handed parts, you'll have one number and then you'll have the next number in brackets next to it to represent the one in brackets being the same part on the opposite side of the vehicle. However, that's not what they do here for some reason. They use L1 and L2 and they have 1 in brackets even though they're actually different wheels that don't go on at the same time. So which is completely wrong. Essentially L1 is the standard bogey wheel that is in all 4 positions at the rear, while L1 is a different wheel that goes to the front. And they're not interchangeable because L1 has like a hub molded onto it, L2 doesn't because it's a special hub, because at the front there's no bogey and stuff around it. It's just confusing because they did this weird numbering system that just makes no sense for that step. And the next thing you'll do is you'll go onto the rear of the hull and you'll assemble like the idler and stuff like that. And there's this rear hull brace that goes in the kit between these 2 idler bulges here. And you shouldn't do that. I made a mistake of following the kit instructions without looking at references first. And there are essentially 2 types of hull reinforcement that were done on the Panzer I for whatever reason. There's this thick welded pipe that goes between the idler bulges. And that's what the instructions show you doing, and that's what I initially did. But that's actually incorrect. So what you should do is not use this, and instead use the other type, which is a thin reinforcing bar that's higher up on the rear plate, but does the same job. And the parts for that are actually in the kit because they're from previous versions of this Panzer I Ausf.B kit. They're just unused. So I found an older instruction manual that showed putting on these parts, and therefore I was able to locate them on the sprues, and I just went with that. So I cut off the existing part that I put on, filled the holes that you have to drill for it, and then I put on this new reinforcing bar instead of the reinforcing pipe. Now the reason I did that is because both types of reinforcement are fine for a Panzer I Ausf.B, just depending on when it was built or whatever. You can have either type. But every single vehicle I've seen that has this big demolition thing on the back, they all have the thin reinforcing bar type. So for this version vehicle, that's why I had to make that change. In step number 3, you're going to take off the really irritating sprue attachment gates from the sprockets, which is just a little bit tricky. Then you're going to also do some PE on the edge of the fenders. As you can see, you've got a thin strip of photo white that goes all the way along the edge of the fenders, which is kind of, I guess it just makes it a little bit more scale thickness, but it's not really something you would realize. But I did it anyways. It's not too tricky, it's just a really, really long part that you have to do a little bit of simple bending at the end to make it go around the in cut there for the little spring for the mud flap. And then there's like even like a little hole, so this peg comes through and it all lines up perfectly when you put on that little spring. It just slots in perfectly. It's like the most satisfying part of the build, essentially, that tiny little spring at the back there. Now in this part of the build at step number 3, they also show you putting on the front, I'm going to call it the bow plate right here. And I would not recommend doing that at this time. The reason is the bow plate, the glacis, superstructure, engine deck, and the rear plate all don't have, let's just say, really positive fit. There's a little bit of play in the angles that they can have. So if you were to put on, let's say, the bow plate now, glue it on and then just continue with the rest and then try to put on the rest of it later, it's possible that you've put it on at a slightly different angle and then everything's going to shift and you're going to end up with a gap. I had that issue on my Panzer I Ausf.A that I built from Dragon a long time ago. So do not glue on the bow plate now. Leave it separate. There's no problem with doing this. And then wait until you've got it and the glacis, superstructure, engine deck, and rear all not necessarily done, but all ready to go. And then you can just put them all on at once and make sure that everything lines up properly. I would really recommend doing that because that's what I did here, and I had no gaps this time. Step number 4 is the next step in the instructions, and you can see that you can see my reinforcing bar there. So a few things I want to point out here. First of all, I added a bit of a weld. You can see it there, the black line. Archer resin weld decal. I added it there because there's a little bit of like a seam line or whatever, but there should be a weld. They also don't tell you to put on a rear light. They just skip it over it, and then there's no rear light, and there's a hole in the plate. So they give you 3 types of rear light in the kit. You've got the early style, which is a round one that looks almost like what you see on a Sherman. You've got this one here, which is the mid type, which is like a big box with the 4 little light holes. And you also have the later type, which is that clear tube. You have all 3, and all 3 are correct for different versions, but again, every single vehicle that has this, in photos that I've seen, has this mid boxy square type of rear light. So I just put it on. Again, it's in the kit, just not even called out for in the instructions, so it's pretty easy to find. You'll also assemble the exhaust, which is 2 parts, halves of the cylinder essentially, but they fit very, very well. And then on top of it, you have this photo etched muffler shield, whatever, like the thing with all the holes in it. You can see it there. It's a little bit tricky to bend because it is a flat piece you have to turn into a cylinder. I just did this by using progressively smaller handles of knives and paintbrushes and such, bending it around smaller and smaller ones until it is the right size to fit on there. And then after you've bent it into that semicircular shape, you have to bend these over these tiny little lips at the end, which are quite tricky because they're very small, and I don't have a photo etch bending tool or anything like that. So I just did it with a small pair of pliers, a little bit haphazardly, but it ended up looking good in the end, so it wasn't too tricky. The rear hull toe point has a pin mark on it, which is a little bit tricky to fill because it's just in a small little detail part. And I also added a tiny little chain onto it using a model railroad chain. If you want to find small chains, look in the model railway section of your local hobby center, because that's where all the super, super tiny ones are. Alright, now the next step in the instructions is step number 5, and this is what it all starts to go horribly, horribly wrong. So in the standard set of instructions for step number 5, they have you putting on the armor plates around the superstructure, because they basically give you like an internal frame onto which you put the roof and the front and the side plates and everything like that. And they also give you a second instruction set number 5, which is a correction sheet. The reason why there's a correction sheet is because there's in the original instructions they show you putting on armor sets with countersunk screws, which is correct for a Panzer.I Ausf.B. Panzer.I Ausf.B has some differences in the rain guards, and the most importantly is there's no more countersunk screws. Instead, there's these conical bolts which stick out, and that's what they show you putting on in the corrected step number 5. Except they don't, because in step number 5 with the correction, they show you putting on one set of bolted plates that doesn't really fit, and there's another set of bolted plates. There's a third set of bolted plates in the kit that is unused, and that's the set you should go with, because it fits on there properly, and it doesn't have extra armor plates that are for some reason on there but aren't in any photos. I can never see the vehicle. So yeah, there's this is a classic Dragon moment, but it's a double Dragon moment, because they have instructions that are wrong, and then they give you a correction sheet which is also wrong, and then you're supposed to go with these unused parts which are still in the kit somewhere. Now maybe because I went with this third set of plates, I had a little bit of a fit problem. So with the front plate, I had about a 1.5 millimeter gap on the sides, which is huge. You know, like I was wiggling the front plate back and forth. It was kind of comedic almost. It was so bad. And then also the side plates had a little bit of a gap along the roof. Now this gap here wasn't hard to fix because it was pretty small. It was a standard gap. So I just used some Mr. Surfacer 500, put a little bit in there, and then waited half an hour and sanded it flush. That was no issue. But the big gap on the front plate, I had to fill that by jamming in a huge, like 1.5 mil thick sheet of card and then trimming it down. And then I went in after with putty and sanded it anyways. But it was just like these huge gaps in the armor plates. Like, it's almost like the armor plates weren't meant for this kit because they just didn't fit at all. It was a little bit depressing. At this point, they also have you put on all the hatches on the superstructure. And the hatch here for the access door doesn't fit because I tell you to put on part C20, which is way too small. Doesn't line up at all with the hinges. So instead, go with part F14, again in the kit, because that one is the same piece, but it fits. I don't know. In the next step, you're going to put on these tiny little bolted plates, which you can see underneath the hatch there. There's one on this side and one on the opposite side, and it's very confusing. As you can see, this plate has basically 6 bolts along the bottom, and then on the top it's got 2 and 2, and then there's no 2 bolts in the middle on the top. I put this on upside down at first because of the very, very confusing instructions. Because on the other side, over here behind the support for the antenna, it's on the other way around. So it's got the 6 bolts on the top and then the 2 and 2 on the bottom. When on this side, if you look, it's got the 6 bolts on the bottom and the 2 and 2 on the top. And it's confusing because they show you putting on one and they show you putting on the other, but then in one of them it's upside down. They flip the entire vehicle upside down. So it looks like you're putting it on the same orientation both times, but one is you're putting it upside down on the upside down assembly, so it's actually backwards. So I got confused and I put this one on upside down because I did it as it was on the other side. So I had to actually slice out the bolts and then move them down and glue them back on. So just be aware of the instructions here because it's very, very confusing how these plates go on. In step number 7, you work on the engine deck. To start off with, there's some options for photo etch louvers on this little set on the back here. But to use the photo etch parts, you have to cut some of the plastic bits off of this plastic part, and it's just going to go horribly, horribly wrong with my photo etch skills, and it's going to end up looking worse than the plastic part, which looks fine. So I didn't go with that PE option. Also here, there's a mislabeled hatch on the engine deck. This little guy over here, it's just like the wrong part number completely. Because if you use that hatch that they call out, it doesn't fit. And then you also put on the sides of the engine deck here, which do not fit at all. Once again, you get big gaps on the top that you have to fill. Turning the page in the instructions to step number 8, the first thing you're greeted with is the front toe points magically appear on without any callouts. So you have to find part B13 and you have to put them on at this point because Dragon forgets to tell you to put them on. They just appear in the instructions. Also at this point you do all the tools, and it's a little bit confusing here. You get some misnumbered parts and so on. So right off the bat, there's a misnumbered part for the jack assembly. They also don't tell you to put on this part B10 underneath the shovel. It just once again appears on between steps. I mounted the no-tech light. There's no hole for it. You have to just kind of eyeball it. And then I also added a small conduit line because I saw this really strange curvy conduit in all these photos, so I just made that myself from some copper wire and added that in place. The kit tool clamps are also very simplified because they're just kind of like the molded blob. There isn't a handle that you would use to unlatch it. So I just took some photo etch accessories that I have. I have a lot of photo etch tool clamps that I'm never going to use. So what I do now is I just take the handles off and I glue those onto the plastic, and that combination actually looks really, really good. You have a good amount of detail with the molded on blob, which looks acceptable. And then when you add the photo etch handle, that really ups the level of detail because I didn't really want to go through the effort of doing the full PE clamps for all the clamps on this vehicle. You also at this point put on the jack block, which has some of the most hideous straps I've ever seen. Just these huge molded plastic triangles. It's really, really bad. So I cut off those straps, and I also redid the, or not really redid, but I added the wood grain texture because they only give you wood grain texture on the top of the wooden block. The sides and the front and back don't have any. So I carved it in with a number 11 blade. I did linear stripes on the sides to match the top, and then at the ends I did almost like a curved pattern to make it look like a piece of wood. So I went in and I added this photo etch strap, emulating what the big plastic molded blob looked like. So it's just a T34 spare, like ice cleat strap, I guess. And I just put it on with some little tiny like hooks that are on the fender. And it looks very, very good. I'm surprised that it came out as well as it did because I'm notoriously bad with photo etch, I guess we can say. But it came out looking really, really good, so I'm proud of that. Definitely looks better than the molded plastic blob you had to start with. So at this point I also added some welds on the engine deck. The reason I did this was that there already was a nice molded on weld line at the top here, but there was a kind of a gap in it. Not sure why. It might have had something to do with the slide molding process, but there was this big honking gap in the weld seam. So instead of trying to like add a little bit of weld there to fill that gap and make it match the rest, I just scraped the whole weld off really easy with a hobby knife, and then I added another one of these Archer resin weld decals. These are really, really easy, especially if you're doing long straight welds like this. It's much faster than any other method. And while they're not exactly the most beautiful looking welds in the world, they match very well with the molded on welds in most kits. So they don't stand out as being like suddenly a handmade weld here when the rest of the kit is a little bit more squishy welds, but definitely looks good. And I also did the same on the back edges of the engine deck because it was kind of missing from there as well. So since I was doing one weld, I might as well do all of them, right? Alright, now let's look at the demolition sling whatever thing. This is actually basically the only redeeming part of the build because it was the part that went together very well. I guess since it's a completely new assembly, there was no like half-assed parts that are new and old going together. no warping at all. These parts are all molded, like these big bendy pipes and everything. It's really, really beautiful. Everything fits together perfectly. You have these really nice welds on it. It was a dream to put this thing together. Only one minor thing was that there was a misnumbered part. Something was like 16 instead of 17 or 15. And but it was really obvious because right next to it was the part that they also were calling out with the same number, and it's completely different. So it was not a confusing assembly at all. It goes together really, really well. There was a little bit of a seam line around the box at the end here because it's slide molded, so you kind of have like some seams, but it's easy to clean up because it's a box, so it's just a bunch of flat sides. One thing I did do was I replaced this kind of tension cable. It's not an electronic cable to detonate it, it's just like a tension member to support the weight of the box, essentially. The cable they give you is this really, really big, nasty, they basically give you like a massive Panzer tow cable from like a King Tiger, which is huge and it's way out of scale. So instead of using that, I just took a spare bit of electronic cable from my spares bin, you know, old earbuds die. I just stripped the cable out of them, put that in here, and it looks much more in scale. So that's what I used here. But this assembly here goes together like a dream. It's really, really good. While we're on the rear of the hull, let's look at the smoke candle. This is a 3D printed part by FC Model Trend. Here's the box. As you can see, it's a Nebel, blah, 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 for a Panzer II. And the reason why I went with the Panzer II is because nobody makes a Panzer I smoke candle in the world. But the Panzer II one is exactly the same, except for the mounts are a little bit different. So you can see it's got these curvy things to go over the exhaust. So instead I made my own out of photo etch, as you can see on here now. Just some spare PE in my bin, kind of like bent it and folded it. And it actually came out looking quite good for what these things look like. So the reason why I added the smoke candle here is because, once again, every single photo I can see of one of these Panzer I Ausf.Bs that has the demolition charge also has one of these guys on it. So it's like these are all upgrades that must occur at the same time. So if your vehicle is one that has been upgraded with a demolition charge, it's going to also have the smoke candle upgrade and the mid-rear light and so on. Just some things like that are, you know, you see them in photos, but Dragon doesn't add them because they're lazy and they don't want to mold you a new part, so they just skip adding a smoke candle in the kit, even though they definitely could. Alright, now the last part of this build is the turret, and I have completely skipped over it because of some reasons. Mainly, it's not done yet. As you can see, I've not put on the viewports. The reason is, remember when I was talking earlier about the superstructure armor and how they give you a couple of new sets that have these bolts instead of countersunk screws? You can see countersunk screws on the front plate there. All the little guys on there are all countersunk, but then if you look here, you see these bolts. That's correct. But when they did the Panzer I Ausf.B, when they added the bolts on the sides of the superstructure, they also did the same on the sides of the turret. And they don't give you that in this kit. They give you a Panzer I Ausf.A turret, which has countersunk screws everywhere, so top and sides. They should have molded you a new turret with the conical bolts all over the sides, and they didn't. They're lazy. They're reusing old parts like this old Panzer I Ausf.A turret, which is fine for the Panzer I Ausf.A, but I mean, for me, it's a little bit depressing. Now, some people don't care about this kind of stuff because I'm like literally being a river counter now. I'm like, oh, well, there's 60 countersunk screws on the back of this turret that I have to replace with bolts. I'm going to have to buy a set of like 0.6 millimeter diameter conical bolts, and I'm going to put them in all these tiny little viewport holes, all 60 of them, 60, and then I'll put the viewports on. Come on, Dragon, you can't mold us a new turret for this kit. They just reuse the old parts and they don't care about it. Oh, and before I forget, they tell you to put on a different hatch, which doesn't fit. The part number is wrong, and then if you go for looking through the sprues, eventually you'll find this hatch, which fits. Once again, parts that don't fit. Yeah, as you can see, this kit wasn't exactly the most pleasant build experience I've ever had. A lot of standard Dragon isms. Instructions skipping parts, things just appear between steps. You know, there's parts missing from the kit. There's instructions that have misnumbered stuff. There's some poor fit, really, really confusing. But then you also pair that with some really, really nice detail, like really nice bolts and rivets and everything like that. Really nice tread pattern, really nice welds. So it's like it's double-edged sword of it. Looks really, really good, but it's, you know, like suffer building this thing. It's just like a pain in the butt. And so for that very reason, if you want to build a Panzer I Ausf.B in 1/35 scale, buy the new Takom kit. If you want to build a Panzer I Ausf.B with the demolition sling, buy the other new Takom kit in 1/16 scale. But we got bolts on the turret instead of screws, and it probably fits together a little bit better than this hodgepodge of just like random old parts plus new ones. And maybe I should have said this at the beginning, but I often get comments from people when I make a video like this who are like, oh, when I built kits 30 years ago, they all sucked, and this is just part of being a modeler. And like, yeah, I get it, and that's why I'm fixing them. But it's also a little bit depressing to spend $60 on a kit, and then it's just like a cash grab where Dragon's just tossing old and new parts together, not caring about how they fit or how the instructions represent that. And then it's a bit of a painful process. You can do it. I'm not exactly the most skilled modeler in the world. I'm not bad, but like, I'm not a scratch builder in any way, and I've managed to make this kit look decent. You know, I've polished the turd that is the Panzer I Ausf.B by Dragon, and yeah, if I can do it, you probably can too. And hopefully this video helps you out in that regard, or at least helps you out maybe making the decision to not buy this kit, instead buying the Takom 1/35 scale or 16 scale kits. This wasn't the worst kit I've ever built, but it was the most Dragon kit I've ever built, let's say that. Well, I like to make my kit reviews honest like this, so you guys can see really how the kit is to build. So as always, if you have any questions or comments, post them in the comment section below. I always read through them all, and I'm always willing to get new video suggestions from people who have ideas down there. If you want to support me on Patreon, you can do that with the link on screen now. Those guys give me a little bit of money every month, which helps me buying kits and paints and aftermarket accessories to correct kits like this. And they also get early access to my videos when I have the chance to do so. As always, I will see you guys next time. Goodbye, stay safe, and happy modeling. See you then.